Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window at 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was the wind. The house I had recently moved into was old enough that it creaked and groaned like a person in pain when the wind blew too hard. It had been a quiet night, the kind where the stillness of the house settles deep into your bones. Everything felt calm, almost serene. But then, just as I was drifting back to sleep, I heard it again. Tap! Tap! Not the whisper of wind against the window. This was deliberate. Someone or something was tapping with purpose. I froze, my body stiffening as my mind scrambled for an explanation. It wasn't the wind. My heart thudded in my chest, the pulse of adrenaline making my palms sweat. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was a branch, a twig scraping against the window in the breeze. It made sense, right? I mean, this house was on a quiet street in rural Texas, surrounded by trees and fields. I'd gotten used to the creaking of the old wood and the sounds of the house settling at night. But this was different. I strained my ears. Tap! 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 It was too rhythmic, too steady. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 2:03 a.m. The house was unnervingly quiet now, save for the steady ticking of the clock. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. I couldn't hear anything except that tapping. It didn't stop. It was persistent. I swallowed hard, the knot in my stomach tightening. What was it? I needed to know. But fear kept me rooted to the bed, paralyzed by a strange instinct. If I didn't move, maybe it would stop. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I slid my feet out from under the covers, feeling the cold of the hardwood floor seep into my skin. The chill made me shiver, but I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like they were made of stone, stiff and unyielding. I was still half dreaming, still caught between sleep and wakefulness, but I knew I couldn't let it go. I had to check. The room was pitch dark except for the faint moonlight seeping through the cracks in the blinds. The only sound was my breathing, shallow and fast, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stepped forward, my footfalls almost soundless on the floor. Each step felt like it was taking forever. I didn't want to move toward the window, but I couldn't stop myself. There was something about that tapping. It felt too purposeful, too insistent. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the cold screen lighting up as I unlocked it. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight, the beam piercing the darkness, and slowly, cautiously, made my way toward the window. The tapping had grown louder, more frantic, almost like someone was testing the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I stood there for a long moment, my breath caught in my throat. The window was on the second floor of the house, and I couldn't think of anything that could possibly be down there. No tree branches, no animals that could have made such a deliberate noise. Maybe it was a person. The thought hit me like a cold wave, washing over my skin and making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No, it couldn't be. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. I wasn't ready to look. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face whatever might be out there. It was too much. The sound, the tension in the air, it was unbearable. I moved, just slightly, pulling the curtain back a little to peer through the sliver of space. That's when I saw him. A figure standing motionless just outside the window, his face pressed so close to the glass that I could see the breath fogging up the surface. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark jacket with a hood pulled low over his face. But what struck me the most were his eyes. They were wide open, unnaturally wide, and they stared at me without blinking. His pupils were dilated, almost too large for the dim light. His mouth hung slightly open like he was waiting for something. I froze, my body locked in place, the world narrowing down to those eyes. My chest tightened, the air in the room growing thick and suffocating. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. He didn't blink. Not once. My mind raced, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. Was this a prank? Was I just dreaming? But then I saw his hand shift. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down, and when he pulled his hand back up, I saw it. A brick. He raised it, his fingers curled around it like he had all the time in the world. And then, without warning, he hurled it at the window. The impact was deafening. The brick slammed into the glass with such force that the window shattered immediately, sending shards of glass flying into the room. The sound of the crash was like a gunshot, sharp and violent. I stumbled backward, the force of the noise knocking the breath out of me. My heart was hammering in my chest, louder than the glass shattering. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted out of the room, my feet barely touching the ground as I dashed down the hall. My mind screamed at me to hide, to do anything to get away. The footsteps behind me, the sound of the man pushing through the broken window, were so close I could hear his ragged breathing. My body moved on instinct. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. I made it to the nearest closet and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone, but I dialed 911 as quickly as I could. 911? What's your emergency? The operator's voice was eerily calm, like nothing was wrong. I couldn't make sense of my words. Someone's outside my window. He broke the glass. He's coming. Ma'am, are you safe? What's your address? I gave her my address, my voice barely a whisper. I could hear the panic in my breath, but the operator kept speaking in that same calm, detached tone. It only made everything worse. Every second felt like a lifetime. I kept my ear pressed to the closet door, straining to hear anything, any sign of movement. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, sharp and quick. Then I heard it. Footsteps, light but definite. Slow, moving toward the closet. I held my breath, waiting. But when I peeked through the crack in the door, there was nothing. No one. I felt the tension in my chest tighten even more. Was he still out there? Was he waiting? Minutes passed. I don't know how long. Finally, I heard the sirens, distant but unmistakable. The sound brought a strange sense of relief, but it didn't make the terror go away. When the police arrived, I bolted from the closet, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hardly believe I was still standing, still breathing. They searched the house, the yard, the area around the property. They found nothing. The officer told me it was probably a random break-in attempt, that the man had heard me moving and had run off when he saw the lights of the patrol car. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had happened. He had been there. Right there, just outside my window. The police left, and the house felt eerily empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, waiting for another chance. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I didn't sleep for days. I started locking all the windows, checking them again and again before going to bed. But something about that place, the walls, the rooms, even the air, felt wrong now. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a random guy who got scared off. But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, just waiting for the next chance to come back. The small town of Texas was everything I had hoped for. Quiet, charming, and the perfect place to put down roots after years of moving from one apartment to the next. The streets were lined with towering oaks, their branches weaving together like a protective canopy overhead, casting dappled shadows across the weathered sidewalks. The houses, old but sturdy, sat proudly in their own space, each with its own history. My new home was no exception. An aging craftsman-style house with a porch that creaked with every step, its faded paint telling stories of better days. It needed work, but that didn't bother me. I loved it. It was a place I could finally call home. The first few days felt like a dream. The neighbors were friendly, and the air always smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know the town. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but that's exactly what I wanted. Then there was him. I first noticed the man on the second day. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my morning coffee when I saw him walk by the front window. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with a thin, almost gaunt frame. His clothing was nothing special, just a dark hoodie, baggy jeans, and worn boots, the kind that looked like they'd seen better days. His brown hair hung in messy strands around his face, and his features were forgettable. But there was something about him, something unsettling. At first, I told myself it was nothing. People walk through neighborhoods all the time, maybe on their way somewhere or just out for a stroll, but something didn't sit right with me. The way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he had nowhere to be, like he was in no rush, struck me as odd. He didn't seem to notice me, but I felt like I was being watched, even though he never looked in my direction. The next day, I saw him again, and then again, and again. At first, it was subtle. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon, a few hours later, in the evening. Each time he passed by my house, never stopping, never glancing at the windows or the door, but always in my peripheral vision, walking slowly down the street. It was like clockwork. Each time he passed, I felt a little more uneasy. By the third day, he was back, and this time, it wasn't just a casual walk. He came by twice, and the second time, he slowed to a near crawl as he passed. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, but I could sense his awareness of my presence. I couldn't explain it, but it was like he was waiting for something, or someone. The next few days blurred together, and so did the man's movements. Every time I turned around, there he was, always walking. Always the same route. There was no change in pace, no variation. It was almost like he was tracking something. My house, maybe? The thought gnawed at me, but I kept brushing it aside. But then something shifted. I started to notice patterns. I'd glance out the window, and there he'd be, appearing at exactly 3:17 p.m. on weekdays. Then, again at 7:35 p.m., I started to wonder if he was keeping some sort of schedule, his appearances timed down to the minute like a clock ticking relentlessly. I tried to ignore it. I really did. It was probably just a coincidence, I told myself. Maybe he was just out for walks. Maybe he had no destination. Maybe it was all in my head. But then I ran into Mrs. Reynolds, the older woman who lived 2 doors down. She was standing in her front yard, trimming her hedges when she caught sight of me. "You've seen him too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. I felt a coldness slide into my chest, my throat tightening. "Who?" "The man," she whispered, her eyes darting down the street. "The one who walks by. I've seen him around here for weeks. Always the same, always pacing, like he's waiting for something. I don't trust him." I couldn't help but shiver. I had never mentioned anything about the man to her, but she seemed to know exactly who I was talking about. Her voice dropped even lower. "He walks like he's got nowhere to go, like he's checking out the houses, and not just your house. All of them. I don't like it." I nodded slowly, my stomach churning with a mix of dread and disbelief. What was he doing? What did he want? But I didn't say anything to Mrs. Reynolds. I didn't want to make it seem like I was paranoid. Then that evening, things changed. It was around 8 p.m., the light just beginning to fade into twilight. I had finished dinner and was clearing the table when I looked out the window. There he was again, just like clockwork, but this time he didn't walk by. He stopped, right in front of my house. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him stand there, not moving, just waiting. His back was to me, but I could see the outline of his body in the dimming light, and I felt the weight of his presence in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier, colder. My pulse quickened. He was standing too still, too long. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Was he watching me? The feeling of being watched pressed on my chest like a hand squeezing tighter with each passing second. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly started walking again, fading into the darkness. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my mind. Every noise, the creak of the house settling, the rustle of leaves, made my heart race. What was he waiting for? Why was he standing there, right in front of my house? The next few days were more of the same. He appeared at his usual times, walking by slowly, almost methodically, always stopping, always looking, though never directly, always just enough to make my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the focus of his attention, like he was waiting for some moment to finally strike. And then came that night, the night I thought I'd never forget. I had just settled into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, when I heard it. A faint scratching, like fingernails on glass. I froze. My heart stopped. It wasn't loud, just soft, but unmistakable. I forced myself to move, to open my eyes. My mind screamed that it couldn't be real, but when I turned toward the window, I saw him, his face pressed against the glass. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. His eyes, wide, unblinking, stared back at me. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared, his breath fogging up the window. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't think, I couldn't scream. His presence was suffocating, like his gaze was crawling inside my head, taking up every inch of space. And then, finally, I screamed. "Get away from my house!" He jerked back, his hands shooting up defensively, like he had been caught doing something wrong. For a moment, he stood there, frozen, before turning and bolting down the street at a speed that made my head spin. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 as I rushed to the window. I saw him still running, disappearing around the corner of the block. The police arrived just 10 minutes later. I could barely explain what had happened, my words stumbling over each other as I tried to make sense of it all. They searched the area but found nothing, until a patrol car radioed in. They had found him, a few blocks away, sitting on a bench in a dazed state. When they brought him in for questioning, they told me he'd been stalking me. He'd been walking by my house for weeks, taking the same route, hoping to catch a glimpse of me, and the night he tried the window, it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. He'd been planning it. His reason? I just wanted to see if you were real, if you were what I thought you were. I couldn't breathe. He thought I wasn't real? That was it. I couldn't stay. I packed my car and went to stay with my parents, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He was still out there. Maybe he was always out there. I never saw him again. But the memory of his eyes, that cold, unwavering stare, still haunts me, and I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I moved to the house in Texas just over 2 weeks ago, eager for a fresh start. The house was old, a faded, one-story rancher nestled at the edge of a sprawling piece of land. I thought it was perfect. Quiet, secluded, away from the noise and bustle of city life. A place to escape, breathe, and reset. But almost from the moment I stepped foot in that house, something felt off. Maybe it was the creaking of the floorboards under my feet, or the wind whistling through the cracks in the window frames. Maybe it was the silence that enveloped the house at night, a silence so complete it almost felt suffocating. It started small. At first, I noticed scratches on the back door. Just a few faint marks, like someone had dragged something sharp across the wood. I figured it was probably the house settling. The place was old, built back in the 70s, and everything seemed a little worn around the edges. No big deal. But over the next few days, the scratches grew longer and deeper. They weren't just a few random gouges, they were deliberate, almost like someone had taken a knife and dragged it across the door repeatedly. I stood there one evening, staring at the deep, jagged lines in the door, a creeping sense of unease crawling up my spine. But I brushed it off. I was just being paranoid, right? The house had probably just seen some wear and tear from previous owners. I couldn't afford to start making a big deal out of every little thing that felt off. Old houses made weird sounds, right? It's nothing to get worked up about. But then things started to get worse. It was late afternoon, the sun starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. I'd finally unpacked the last of my boxes and was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. I had left the kitchen light on, and the glow of it reflected off the kitchen window, illuminating the backyard. It all seemed fine at first, the overgrown lawn, the rusting shed, the stillness of the air. But something was wrong, a shape. I squinted, unsure if I was seeing things. But no, there, standing just by the back door, was a man, tall, thin. His face obscured by shadows, but his eyes, those eyes, pierced through the darkness, staring directly at me. I felt an icy shiver run down my spine, and I froze, unable to move. I didn't dare take my eyes off him. The man didn't blink. He didn't move. He just stood there watching. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A neighbor, maybe someone walking by, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood. It wasn't casual. It wasn't normal. He was waiting, watching. I felt the blood drain from my face, and my hands trembled as I reached for my phone. My fingers fumbled over the numbers, but my throat had gone dry. The words wouldn't come. What do you even say in a situation like this? There's a man standing in my backyard? It sounded ridiculous. After what felt like an eternity, the man slowly began to back away, retreating into the trees. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. I waited for the longest time, staring out the window, but he didn't reappear. I immediately locked all the doors and windows. Double-checked the deadbolts, even though I already knew they were secure. I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the house seemed louder than it should be. The wind outside rattled the old windows, and the shadows from the trees swayed, casting odd shapes against the walls. I was too scared to close my eyes, afraid I would blink and somehow miss him slipping through the back door. The next morning, I went out to the backyard to check. No signs of anyone being there, nothing had been disturbed. But then I saw it. A footprint, fresh in the dirt by the back door. Not a normal one. This was large, the size of a boot that didn't match mine. It looked too big for someone I knew. I backed away from it, my pulse quickening. This wasn't an animal or a stray dog. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I called the sheriff's office, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. They sent a deputy out, but when he arrived, he didn't seem too concerned. He inspected the scratches, the footprint, and the area around the back door. Could be coyotes, wild pigs, he suggested, scratching his stubbled chin. They roam around here sometimes. You'll see all kinds of tracks after the rain. But I knew it wasn't an animal. I could feel it. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. It was the way the scratches were arranged, the way the footprint was so deliberate. No wild animal left a footprint like that. And the way the man had just stood there in my yard? No. This was no coincidence. I didn't press the deputy further, but I knew I couldn't ignore what had happened. The sense of being watched only grew stronger. The next few nights were the worst. I started hearing soft, almost imperceptible thuds, like someone was walking around outside. The sound of the back door scraping against the frame. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the wind pushing against the wood. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't just hearing things. I wasn't imagining it. Then one morning, my neighbor Tom came over to check on me. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, with graying hair and a slow drawl. He lived 2 houses down and had stopped by a few times to introduce himself when I moved in. He wasn't exactly the neighborly type, but I appreciated his check-ins. "You got anyone else living with you?" he asked, scanning the yard nervously as though looking for something. "No, it's just me," I replied. I didn't know what to make of his tone, but I figured he was just being friendly. Tom shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting something. "Well, you should know," he said, his voice dropping lower. "There's been talk. People around here have seen someone hanging around your place, seen a man watching your house. Ain't right." My blood ran cold. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. My heart began to race, but I pushed the words from my mind. Before I could respond, I saw him. That same figure from the night before, standing just beyond the tree line in the shadows, barely visible. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might draw attention. Tom's face drained of color and his voice faltered. "That's him. That's the guy I've been talking about." His eyes locked onto the figure, then back at me. "You need to be careful." The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, his eyes glinting in the dark. Then, in one swift motion, he turned and disappeared into the woods. Tom was visibly shaken. "I've seen him before, but never this close," he muttered. "I don't know who he is, but he's been watching you." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't just an old house with creaky floors. Someone had been stalking me. And it wasn't just some random stranger. I spent the rest of the day pacing inside, my mind racing. Then, on the 4th night after Tom's warning, it happened. I was in bed, drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the back door creaking open. My heart leapt into my throat and I held my breath. I grabbed my phone, whispering to the 911 dispatcher, "Someone's outside my house. They're coming in. Please help me." When the police arrived, they quickly apprehended the man, just a few hundred yards from my back door, hidden in the shadows. Once you realize you've been stalked, you can never truly forget. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.